Now, in this work, and this has come up in your remarks so far, there seems to be a perennial tension since policy decisions in this arena have so far resulted in white communities having more resources. That there's an implied suggestion that Black people and other people of color should move into communities to have access to better schools. How have you responded to that in your work?
I'll take the lead on this one, Cashauna, and I'm sure you'll follow. So overwhelmingly, what I remind folks of is at this point in my career, I have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of families of color. And I'm talking in the Midwest, I'm talking in the Northeast, I'm talking all around the country. And I'm going to tell you something honestly. Less than 5 interviews have ever said, you know what I want to do? Live in a white neighborhood. That should be very telling to us. Repeatedly, I hear people talk about wanting good schools, safe communities, access to transportation, green spaces. But what they don't say is like, magically, if I were to move to a white community, things would be fine. Now, the things that get concentrated and have been hoarded in white communities, surely people desire access to that, right? But I think we are also, as we come up on the 70th anniversary of Brown, and I echo here Derek Bell in some sense, the separate and unequal that came out of Plessy versus Ferguson, there's been a large discussion of the separate, but not really a significant discussion of the unequal, right? Imagine if for 70 years we had listened to the voices of people who have been the subjects of the most vicious forms of racism, classism, and segregation and said, what do you need? What does your community need? And they would say, we need strong schools. We need ample resources, not just equal, but disproportionate, right? Progressive policy. We need actual housing units that align with our lives and our needs. We need jobs that are close. What if we had 70 years of investment in those communities from a federal level? Could we even imagine what it would look like? Instead, what has happened is we've had very patchwork investment in communities, and then we have, whether intentionally or not, we've advocated a lot for movement. So when we uplift things like moving to opportunity, the Gautreaux experiment, in which people receive a voucher and they move to another place and they have positive outcomes, we say, there's the solution, if only they could move. Well, the danger in this is that we know everyone can't just up and move. We also know that when you dig into the benefits that people experience, there are also different valences for Black boys, of people of certain ages, right, and different people who are working age. Those things have to be considered. So what I always say to this question of this is really how do we move more poor Black and brown people to well-to-do areas? I say, no, that's not the first order of business. In fact, it's only the first order of business if you don't actually listen to the voices of the people who are most impacted by the systems that you claim to care about.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, gosh, so this question is always a tough one for me, and I always start with this very question is why we need to be really listening to the voices of Black and brown folks that are doing this work, right? And I say this as someone who has been, a fair housing lawyer for, the entirety of my career. And, I certainly understand, right, like the benefits of voucher mobility programs, for instance, as the professor was just discussing, and frankly, I'm very proud of the fact that the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center within the past year has partnered with the Housing Authority of New Orleans to provide supportive services for voucher holding families who are looking to move into different communities, right? Really wanted to be able to get into that work and offer that service for community members. But I think it's important here for this conversation to be nuanced, right? And the people who have had these experiences are the people who understand the very intricate and important nuances of this conversation. So I think we have to be clear that there are families, and particularly when we're talking about families with vouchers, there are absolutely, families who would choose, right, to move into neighborhoods that are well resourced if given the opportunity, right? We can't deny that. And those folks should have the ability to be able to do that. However, we also know that that's not an option for everyone. certainly not space, right, enough for everyone to be able to move to a different community, but also folks may not be interested in leaving their social networks or their families or their schools, right? And so really what is critical, right, is being clear that investment, right, in communities that have been starved of investment has to happen, as well as folks having the ability to actually choose to move to a different neighborhood if they so desire. But I think what's really important here, as we heard from Professor Lewis-McCoy, is the lack of equality, right? You know, I have I've not interviewed, for scholarly purposes, hundreds of families, but I've talked to a whole lot of Black folks, and what I will say is that even Black folks, right, who and people that I know or have worked with who are living in majority white neighborhoods, very often I hear from people, if I could have access to these same amenities, I may not have made the choice to live in this community. I think we have to be clear that there are trade-offs, right? When we make those decisions to place, in particular, Black folks in white communities, or when Black folks do decide to move into white communities, there are absolutely trade-offs that we have to make. I think often about what my mom experienced. My mom is 68 years old. She's 67. And she attended elementary school under a mandatory busing program in Portland, Oregon in the 1960s. So starting in second grade, my mom and her two sisters were bused to a majority white high school. It was a traumatic experience, okay? Having to, having fistfights in elementary school because people didn't want you there, right? Like having children and adults throwing rocks at you as a 7-year-old, right? Because people don't want you in that community. Her experience was such that when the time for high school came and the busing for her stopped being mandatory and she could then choose where she wanted to attend high school, she instantly made the choice to attend the majority Black high school in her neighborhood, right? Now, on the other side of things, my dad was not bused in elementary or middle schools, but busing for him began in high school, and it was voluntary, and he had the choice, right, to decide whether he wanted to stay and go to the majority Black high school or whether he wanted to be bused. And one of the things that my dad was clear about, right, based on conversations with his grandparents who raised him, was that they didn't know what the white students, right, at that school had access to, but they knew they had access to something that my dad's family did not have access to, right? And so my dad made the decision, and he certainly experienced difficulties, but for him felt that the trade-off was worth it. My dad is a college graduate, my mother is not, and within our family, we're very clear, and it feels pretty clear that my dad had access to the tools to get him, right, like to a college education because of the opportunity awarding, right, that was present within the white high school that he attended. And so because I had the lessons, right, behind those nuances ingrained in me, I come to this work with a very full and comprehensive and clear understanding about the trade-offs, right, that folks have to face when they're making these decisions. And it's not fair. And so I think that understanding of that nuance and those trade-offs is really part of what drives my commitment to this work. Because I really hope that future generations don't continue to have to grapple with these things. And we're certainly not there yet, right? We all know that Black and brown families in particular across the country are having to make these decisions every day, particularly Black and brown families with some resources, right, are finding themselves in that same position of, do we stay within segregated public schools that are majority Black or brown if we live in communities of color? Or do we move the family, right, to or start a family in communities that are well resourced, but where folks don't look like us? And I hope that we won't have to continue to grapple with this question, because as a society, we could make different decisions that will not require that families continue to have to think this way about schools and school choice.
Can I veg you back really quickly on Kashauna's comments, which are absolutely brilliant, and I agree that nuance is so necessary and often missed. Keep in mind also that out of all groups of people, Black people have the highest levels of preference for diverse or integrated or non-majority white spaces out of any group, right? That is not the case for all groups, right? So when I think about the possibilities, particularly of Black folks who tend to be hardest hit by segregation, there's a desire to have options and choices between quality goods. And the importance of having a full community with diverse values and beliefs is that, yeah, some folks are going to decide to move and go to the school that someone's like, well, why would you go there? And other folks are going to decide to say, but when you have a choice between quality goods, not just choice, between quality goods, we have a very different conversation.
Exactly. And that's what we're missing, right? The equality is just not there. And so people are being forced to make choices when that are sort of, artificial in many respects, right?
That we shouldn't have to make.
Exactly. We shouldn't have to make them. And people's choices are not based on equality of circumstances, unfortunately.
Boy, rich exchange.